Good evening, kind soul, and welcome to this peaceful space. Whether you've come to wind down for the night or are simply in need of a quiet moment, I'm truly happy you're here. Tonight, we'll drift through the often forgotten story of the Korean War, a conflict shaped by division, courage, and the deep currents of a changing world. If you'd like, share in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is. There's something comforting about knowing we're all part of this quiet journey together. And if you find peace in slow explorations of the past, the cosmos, and the human spirit, feel free to subscribe so you never miss a story. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1: The Divided Peninsula, From Japanese Rule to Cold War Tension. To understand the Korean War, it's necessary to look back before the conflict officially began, back to the early years of the 20th century, when Korea was still a unified nation under its own rule. For centuries, Korea had maintained its independence despite pressure from more powerful neighbors. It was a kingdom with its own culture, language, and government. But in the early 1900s, Korea found itself caught between imperial interests. By 1910, following years of increasing control and influence, Japan formally annexed Korea, turning it into a colony. Japanese rule over Korea lasted for 35 years. From 1910 to 1945. During this time, the Korean people endured widespread oppression. The Japanese colonial government imposed its language, restricted Korean culture, and suppressed any movements for independence. Schools were forbidden from teaching Korean history. Korean names were replaced with Japanese ones. Political dissent was crushed, and those who resisted were often imprisoned or executed. But resistance never fully disappeared. Korean nationalism persisted in quiet ways. In underground schools, in banned literature, and in exile movements abroad. Many Koreans fled to China, the Soviet Union, and even the United States, where they continued to advocate for independence. When the Second World War ended in August of 1945, Japan's defeat meant the end of its empire and the end of its rule in Korea. But freedom for Korea did not come through Korean hands. Instead, a new division was decided in haste by foreign powers. In the final days of the war, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to split Korea into two zones of occupation. The dividing line would be the 38th parallel, a geographical marker chosen with little consultation and no input from the Korean people. The Soviets would accept the surrender of Japanese forces north of the line, while the Americans would do the same in the south. The intention, at least publicly, was to create a temporary arrangement until a unified, independent Korean government could be established. In reality, that temporary division soon became permanent. As the Soviet Union established its presence in the north, it began shaping a new political structure based on Marxist-Leninist ideology. Land reforms, nationalization of industry, and the suppression of opposition were carried out rapidly. At the center of this new northern regime stood Kim Il-sung, a former anti-Japanese guerrilla who had spent years in the Soviet Union and emerged as Moscow's preferred leader in Korea. In the south, the United States backed a very different figure, Syngman Rhee. A conservative and staunch anti-communist, Ri had spent decades in exile, mostly in the United States. He was Western educated, fiercely opposed to communism, and seen by American policymakers as a safe choice to lead a democratic South Korea. By 1948, the divide had solidified. Two separate states were declared. The North became the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with Kim Il-sung as premier. The South became the Republic of Korea, led by President Syngman Rhee. Both governments claimed to be the legitimate rulers of all Korea. Neither recognized the other. This division was not just political, it was increasingly militarized. In the North, Kim Il-sung expanded his military with Soviet assistance. Soldiers were trained by Soviet officers. Modern weapons were supplied. The regime was centralized and tightly controlled. A cult of personality around Kim began to take shape, with state propaganda presenting him as a national savior. In the South, Syngman Rhee's administration struggled with instability. Political opposition was strong, and civil unrest was frequent. Though the United States provided military and financial support, the South Korean government was criticized for its authoritarian tendencies and harsh suppression of dissent. Still, it remained firmly anti-communist, and the US saw it as a critical ally in the early Cold War. Throughout 1949 and into early 1950, tensions escalated. Border clashes along the 38th parallel became more common. Armed skirmishes, small-scale raids, and propaganda campaigns were used by both sides. The line separating the two Koreas was no longer just a political boundary. It had become a fault line, ready to rupture. Both leaders, Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee, expressed the desire to reunify Korea, but each intended to do so under their own rule, and both believed the other regime was illegitimate and dangerous. Kim Il-sung lobbied Joseph Stalin for permission to invade the South. Initially cautious, Stalin eventually gave his approval, along with promises of Soviet equipment and training. Kim also secured support from Mao Zedong in China, who agreed to assist if the United States entered the conflict. By the spring of 1950, North Korea was preparing for war. The Korean Peninsula, once a single ancient nation, had been transformed into two opposing states, shaped by outside powers and Cold War rivalries. The division, intended to be temporary, had become permanent, and the groundwork for a devastating war had been laid. Chapter 2, June 25th, 1950. North Korea strikes South. In the early morning hours of June 25th, 1950, war erupted on the Korean Peninsula. As dawn broke, North Korean forces launched a full-scale invasion across the 38th parallel. This was not a border skirmish or a limited engagement. It was a planned, coordinated assault aimed at conquering the South. The North Korean army, under Kim Il-sung, moved with speed and force. Backed by Soviet support and equipped with modern tanks, artillery, and aircraft, the North Korean military outnumbered and outgunned its southern counterpart. The North committed approximately 75,000 soldiers to the initial attack. They brought with them over 100 Soviet-built T-34 tanks, a powerful symbol of mechanized warfare. The Republic of Korea's army was vastly underprepared. With no tanks, no heavy artillery, and little training in large-scale combat, the South's military was unable to mount an effective defense. At the time of the invasion, the South Korean army had fewer than 40,000 troops near the border. Many of them lacked basic supplies, and some units were without even functional rifles or radio communication. In Seoul, the capital, news of the invasion spread quickly, but it brought panic, not organization. The government, led by President Syngman Rhee, ordered an evacuation as North Korean forces closed in. Within 3 days, Seoul fell. The South Korean military blew up the Han River Bridge to delay the enemy's advance, but the destruction came too late, and at a terrible cost. Hundreds of civilians were still crossing the bridge when it was destroyed. The loss of life was staggering, and the move left many survivors stranded as the capital collapsed. The fall of Seoul was both a military and psychological blow. It seemed to confirm Kim Il-sung's belief that the South would fall quickly and that reunification under his rule was only a matter of time. But outside Korea, the invasion had set off alarm bells. Within 48 hours, the United Nations Security Council met to address the crisis. Because the Soviet Union was boycotting the Council at the time, it was unable to veto any action. As a result, the Council passed Resolution 83, condemning the invasion and calling for member nations to assist South Korea in repelling the attack. The United States, under President Harry Truman, responded immediately. Truman saw the invasion as a direct challenge to the post-World War order and a clear test of American resolve. If communism could expand by force in Korea, Truman feared, it might soon spread to other regions, including Europe. This was the core of the policy known as containment. Truman ordered American air and naval forces into action. Soon after, ground troops were deployed. General Douglas MacArthur, the commanding officer of U.S. forces in the Pacific, was placed in charge of what would become a multinational operation under United Nations command. Still, the situation on the ground continued to worsen. The North Korean military advanced rapidly. After taking Seoul, they moved southward with little resistance. The South Korean army was in retreat, and the few American forces arriving in early July were thrown into battle almost immediately. The first U.S. engagement, near the town of Osan, ended in a costly defeat. American troops, part of what became known as Task Force Smith, were unprepared for the intensity of the North Korean assault. Armed with outdated weapons and short on ammunition, they were quickly overwhelmed. By mid-July, the North had taken control of most of the peninsula. Only the southeastern corner remained in the hands of the South. Here, centered around the vital port city of Busan, South Korean and United Nations forces established a defensive line. This position would become known as the Busan Perimeter. It was a last stand. Supplies were short, roads were crowded with refugees, communications were strained, and morale was fragile. But reinforcements from the United States and other allied nations continued to arrive. The British, Australians, Canadians, and other UN partners joined the defense. US naval power helped protect supply routes, and air superiority gave the defenders a critical advantage in striking enemy positions. By August, the perimeter held. The North Korean army, stretched thin and operating far from its supply bases, began to lose momentum. The first 2 months of the Korean War were among the most devastating. Thousands were killed on both sides. Millions of civilians were displaced. Entire towns and villages were reduced to rubble. As North Korean forces occupied southern territory, they carried out mass executions and targeted suspected collaborators. In response, South Korean forces, fearing uprisings and internal threats, also conducted purges. The Bodo League massacre, one of the most brutal events of the early war, saw the execution of tens of thousands of suspected communists by South Korean authorities. What had begun as a sudden invasion was now transforming into a prolonged and bloody conflict. As August drew to a close, the world was watching. What had started as a civil war on a divided peninsula had grown into a larger struggle, one that would draw in more nations, cost more lives, and leave deep scars on the land and its people. The Korean War was no longer a regional crisis. It had become an international one. Chapter 3. Pusan Perimeter. Holding the Line. By August of 1950, just 2 months after North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, nearly the entire Korean Peninsula had fallen under northern control. The Republic of Korea's army had been pushed to the brink, and the initial wave of American troops had suffered serious losses. Town after town, city after city, had either been captured or evacuated in the face of overwhelming force. Only one corner of the peninsula remained unconquered, the southeast. Here, a defensive line was hastily formed around the vital port city of Busan. It would be the last stand for United Nations and South Korean forces. This area became known as the Pusan Perimeter. The Busan area was more than just a strategic location. It was a gateway. If North Korea took Busan, it would cut off the last major supply port for American and Allied forces. Reinforcements and equipment coming in from Japan and the United States would have nowhere to land. South Korea's government would lose its last foothold. The war, for all practical purposes, would be over. The Pusan Perimeter was roughly 140 miles long, stretching in a wide arc around the southeastern edge of the peninsula. Inside this pocket, a desperate defense was being organized. South Korean forces, reinforced by American troops and supplies, dug into the hills, valleys, and riverlines to create a perimeter that had to hold. By early August, more than 140,000 United Nations troops had arrived, the vast majority of them American. They were met by roughly 90,000 South Korean soldiers, many of whom had retreated hundreds of miles under fire. These forces, though battle-worn and scattered, would now have to resist wave after wave of attack. General Walton Walker, commander of the 8th U.S. Army, issued a clear directive. There would be no further retreat. "We are going to hold this line," he said. "There will be no more retreating, no more withdrawals." His tone matched the gravity of the moment. In the hills near Daegu, along the banks of the Nakdong River, and across the rugged terrain surrounding Busan, the battle for the perimeter began. North Korean forces launched repeated assaults, aiming to break the line and capture Busan. They attacked across multiple fronts, seeking to exploit weak points in the defense. The fighting was intense. Battles lasted for days in brutal heat, with little rest for soldiers on either side. One of the most critical areas was the Nakdong River front. Here, the natural barrier of the river gave defenders an advantage, but North Korean troops repeatedly tried to cross it. In some places, they succeeded. At the Battle of the Bowling Alley, just north of Daegu, US and South Korean forces faced a determined offensive. The defenders responded with artillery, machine guns, and air support. Losses were high, but the perimeter held. Another key moment came in the battles around the Naktong Bulge, where North Korean forces made significant gains and threatened to split the defense in two. American units, including the 24th Infantry Division and the 1st Marine Brigade, were rushed to the scene. With heavy airstrikes and coordinated ground attacks, the bulge was pushed back, but not without significant casualties. Throughout August and into early September, the perimeter was tested continuously. Supplies had to be rushed in by sea and air. Wounded soldiers were evacuated to overcrowded hospitals. Engineers worked constantly to repair bridges and roads destroyed by the retreat. The intense summer heat, combined with rain and mud, made conditions miserable. Despite all of this, the defense held. One of the reasons for this success was the growing air and naval superiority of United Nations forces. American aircraft flew thousands of sorties, striking North Korean supply lines, convoys, and artillery positions. The US Navy, patrolling the southern coast, shelled enemy positions and protected the vital sea lanes to Busan. These efforts slowly began to weaken North Korea's offensive power. In the background, General Douglas MacArthur was preparing something bold, a landing far behind enemy lines. But for that plan to succeed, the perimeter had to hold. Every day that Busan remained in Allied hands was another day the plan could move forward. By mid-September, the momentum began to shift. North Korean forces, having extended their supply lines and suffered heavy losses, were beginning to lose their ability to sustain the offensive. The once relentless advance had slowed. United Nations troops, now better equipped and more coordinated, began to push back in small but critical operations. The Busan perimeter became more than just a defensive line. It was a symbol of resilience. Against overwhelming odds, the combined efforts of South Korean, American, and other Allied forces had stopped the North Korean advance. The tide was beginning to turn. Still, the cost was immense. Tens of thousands had died. Entire cities had been flattened. The peninsula was littered with the wreckage of war. But in the southeast, one piece of territory had been saved, and it would become the launch point for the next phase of the war. The defense of the Busan perimeter proved that North Korea's early success was not unstoppable, and it gave United Nations forces a base from which they would soon go on the offensive. Chapter 4: The Inchon Landing, a daring counterattack. As the summer of 1950 came to an end, the Korean War stood at a critical juncture. North Korean forces had advanced across nearly the entire peninsula. The Republic of Korea's government had been forced to flee. United Nations forces, anchored around Busan, had held the Busan perimeter through sheer determination and costly fighting, but the line could not be held forever. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of United Nations forces in Korea, believed a defensive strategy alone would not win the war. To him, the key was not just to stop the North Korean advance. It was to outmaneuver it. What he proposed was bold, an amphibious landing far behind enemy lines, deep into territory controlled by the North. His chosen target was the port city of Inchon. Located on the west coast of Korea, Inchon sat near the capital city of Seoul. It was far from the front lines, and its geography was daunting. Inchon's harbour had some of the highest tidal ranges in the world, over 30 feet. The landing area was narrow and surrounded by seawalls. The approach was risky, the terrain difficult, and the enemy presence nearby. Many military advisors warned against the plan, calling it too dangerous. But MacArthur insisted. He believed that a surprise landing at Inchon would catch the North Koreans off guard, sever their supply lines, and allow United Nations forces to strike deep into enemy-held territory. It would relieve pressure on the Pusan perimeter and potentially turn the tide of the war. On September 15, 1950, the plan went into motion. The operation, codenamed Chromite, involved over 200 ships, 70,000 troops, and extensive coordination between naval, air, and ground forces. The amphibious assault was one of the largest conducted since the Second World War. It began early in the morning as U.S. Navy vessels bombarded the shore to weaken enemy defenses. Amphibious landing craft then pushed toward the seawall, where United States Marines began scaling the slippery concrete barriers to reach the city beyond. The 1st Marine Division led the assault. They were highly trained, experienced in amphibious warfare, and well-equipped. As they landed, they encountered pockets of resistance, but not the heavy opposition many had feared. The North Korean forces in the area were limited in number and caught by surprise. By the end of the day, the beachhead was secure. In the following days, United Nations troops advanced quickly. Inchon was taken with relatively light casualties compared to the battles at the Pusan perimeter. MacArthur had gambled on the element of surprise, and he was right. From Inchon, the United Nations forces pushed inland towards Seoul. The road to the capital was not without difficulty. The North Koreans, recognizing the threat, moved to defend the city. Fighting in Seoul was fierce. Street by street, block by block, the Marines and South Korean forces advanced. The battle lasted several days, with intense combat in dense urban environments. By September 28th, Seoul had been recaptured. The capital of South Korea, lost in the early days of the war, was once again under Southern control. At the same time, United Nations and South Korean forces launched a breakout from the Pusan perimeter. With North Korean supply lines disrupted and forces pulled away to respond to Inchon, the perimeter held firm and then began to expand. Troops surged forward, retaking towns and villages that had been under northern control for weeks. The North Korean People's Army, which had once seemed unstoppable, now faced a two-front battle. Trapped between advancing forces from the south and the newly landed units from the west, they began to fall back rapidly. The offensive that had driven the war for months collapsed in a matter of weeks. Tens of thousands of North Korean soldiers were captured or killed. Others fled north in retreat. As United Nations forces advanced past the 38th parallel, the original dividing line between north and south, a new question emerged. Should the war stop here, or continue? MacArthur and many United Nations commanders believed the time had come to reunify Korea. With the North Korean army in retreat and with the South now secure, they argued that pushing further north could end the war entirely. The goal, once limited to defending South Korea, now shifted. The new objective became the defeat of North Korea and the unification of the peninsula under the South Korean government. In early October, with authorization from the United Nations, the advance continued. United Nations troops crossed the 38th parallel and began marching north. Inchon had changed everything. What had looked like certain defeat in August had become near total victory by October. The daring landing had turned the tide of the war, militarily, strategically, and psychologically. But the success also brought new risks. To the north, in China, the leadership watched with growing alarm. The border between North Korea and China was defined by the Yalu River, and as United Nations forces pushed closer, Chinese officials feared that the conflict would spill over. Mao Zedong warned that if foreign troops crossed the Yalu, China would intervene. These warnings were not taken seriously by many in Washington. Confident in the momentum of the campaign, MacArthur continued to push north. He dismissed the possibility of Chinese involvement, believing that no major power would dare challenge the United Nations coalition at this stage. But China was already preparing. Inchon's success, while decisive, would not bring the war to a quick end. It had shifted the balance of power, but it had also escalated the stakes. The next phase of the conflict would prove to be even more complex and far more dangerous. For now, however, Inchon stood as a remarkable military achievement. It demonstrated the power of strategic surprise, the importance of logistics and coordination, and the resilience of Allied forces in the face of adversity. In just over 2 weeks, United Nations forces had gone from near collapse to driving back a powerful invading army. Seoul had been reclaimed, the 38th parallel had been crossed, and the war, once thought lost, had entered a new and uncertain chapter. Chapter 5. Crossing the 38th parallel. March to the Yalu. In early October of 1950, United Nations and South Korean forces stood at the 38th parallel, the boundary that had once divided the peninsula into 2 occupation zones following the Second World War. It had also become the starting point of the war that now engulfed Korea. With North Korean forces in retreat after the success of the Inchon landing and the breakout from the Pusan perimeter, United Nations commanders faced a new decision. Should they stop at the 38th parallel, re-establish the status quo, and seek a negotiated peace? Or should they continue the advance into North Korean territory with the goal of reunifying the entire peninsula under the government of South Korea? For many in the West, including General Douglas MacArthur, the answer was clear. The North Korean army had been broken. The opportunity to eliminate the regime and unify Korea under a single, democratic government appeared within reach. President Truman and other leaders, wary of provoking further conflict but unwilling to allow a communist regime to remain in place, authorized the advance. On October 7th, 1950, United Nations troops crossed the 38th parallel. It marked a new phase of the war. What had begun as a defensive campaign to protect South Korea was now an offensive operation inside North Korea itself. The objective was to eliminate any remaining resistance and establish control over the entire peninsula. Initial progress was swift. North Korean forces, having suffered enormous losses in the south, were disorganized and scattered. United Nations and South Korean troops pushed northward, capturing cities and towns with little resistance. Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, fell on October 19th to United Nations forces led by South Korean troops and supported by American units. As they advanced, the landscape changed. The terrain in the north was mountainous, the roads fewer and more difficult. The weather began to turn cold. Supplies had to be brought in over long and narrow routes, vulnerable to ambushes and breakdowns. Still, the momentum remained with the United Nations. But as forces moved farther north, towards the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China, a new threat began to emerge. China had been closely monitoring the situation. From the beginning of the conflict, Chinese leaders viewed Korea as a critical buffer zone. The idea of American and Allied troops approaching the Chinese border was unacceptable to Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. China had only recently emerged from its own long civil war, and its leadership was determined not to allow foreign forces to operate so close to its territory. Throughout October, warnings were issued. Chinese officials delivered messages through diplomatic channels, stating clearly that if United Nations forces crossed the 38th parallel and approached the Yalu, China would intervene. Many in Washington believed these were empty threats. General MacArthur, confident in his campaign, dismissed the warnings as bluffs. But behind the scenes, China had already begun to prepare. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army, a newly formed military force, began moving troops into Manchuria, the northeastern region of China bordering North Korea. Tens of thousands of soldiers were mobilized, moving by night and concealed by the rugged mountains. Their orders were simple: enter Korea, confront United Nations forces, and drive them back from the Yalu River. By the end of October, small clashes began to occur in the north. United Nations patrols reported encounters with unidentified soldiers who were not part of the North Korean army. These troops were better equipped and moved with discipline. The few who were captured or killed wore no insignia, and their identity was initially unclear. But the truth soon emerged. China had entered the war. The first major confrontation came at the Battle of Unsan in early November. United Nations forces, mostly American and South Korean troops, were caught off guard by coordinated attacks from Chinese units. The Chinese struck at night using infiltration tactics, bugle calls, and surprise assaults to create confusion. Entire battalions were surrounded, casualties mounted. For many soldiers, it was the first realization that a new and powerful enemy had joined the fight. Still, the scale of Chinese involvement was not fully understood. After the Battle of Unsan, Chinese forces pulled back, leading United Nations commanders to believe that the threat had passed. MacArthur ordered the offensive to resume, with the goal of reaching the Yalu River and ending the war by Christmas. By late November, United Nations forces had pushed farther north than ever before. The Eighth Army, under General Walton Walker, moved through the western half of North Korea. In the east, U.S. Marines and Army units advanced through the mountains toward the Chosin Reservoir. Morale was high. Some believed the war was nearly over. Then, the full weight of the Chinese intervention struck. On the night of November the 27th, the Chinese launched a massive surprise offensive. Hundreds of thousands of troops, hidden in the mountains and valleys of North Korea, descended on United Nations positions across the front. The attacks were sudden, overwhelming, and relentless. In the west, the Eighth Army suffered heavy casualties and was forced to retreat. In the east, the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir became one of the most brutal engagements of the entire war. Surrounded, outnumbered, and fighting in freezing temperatures that dropped below -30 degrees Fahrenheit, U.S. Marines and Army units fought a desperate battle to break out and retreat to the coast. The Chinese offensive shattered the illusion of victory. What had appeared to be the final phase of the war became a new beginning, one marked by renewed fighting, heavier losses, and growing uncertainty. Crossing the 38th parallel had changed the war once again. The goal of reunification had brought about a new and far more complex conflict. The Korean Peninsula was no longer just a battleground between North and South. It had become a proxy war between global powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, and now China. As the year came to a close, the advance toward the Yalu had turned into a full retreat. United Nations forces pulled back southward, facing the possibility that Seoul, recently liberated, could fall once again. The war, far from ending, was entering its darkest and most difficult phase. Chapter 6: The Chinese Intervention, Retreat and Reversal. In late November of 1950, what had appeared to be the closing act of the Korean War quickly turned into one of its most chaotic and brutal chapters. The surprise Chinese intervention caught United Nations forces entirely off guard. Over the course of just a few days, the war's momentum shifted once again, and this time in favor of the communists. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army, under the command of General Peng Dehuai, had entered the war with careful planning and massive force. By the end of November, over 300,000 Chinese troops had crossed the Yalu River and were operating inside North Korea. Many had marched on foot through mountainous terrain in freezing conditions, carrying only limited supplies and weapons. Their arrival was shrouded in secrecy. Moving primarily at night and avoiding detection by air, they managed to position themselves undetected near key United Nations positions. When the offensive began, it was devastating. In the western sector of the front, United Nations forces under General Walton Walker, including American, South Korean, and other Allied units, were advancing toward the Yalu River. The Eighth Army believed the campaign was entering its final stage. Then, beginning on November 27th, wave after wave of Chinese troops launched sudden attacks on exposed positions. The assault was not marked by superior firepower, but by sheer scale and surprise. Chinese tactics relied on infiltration, flanking maneuvers, and encirclement. Bugles and whistles were used to coordinate attacks and spread confusion. The cold made everything worse. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, and soldiers suffered not only from enemy fire, but also from frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion. Caught off guard and stretched too thin, the Eighth Army was forced to retreat. The line collapsed in several areas. Entire units had to withdraw quickly or risk being cut off. The retreat was disorderly in places, and communication between units was often lost. What had seemed like an advancing army now became a retreating one, moving southward through snow and over frozen rivers, leaving behind equipment and wounded. To the east, the situation was no better. At the Chosin Reservoir, United States Marines and Army units had advanced deep into northeastern North Korea. The terrain was unforgiving: steep mountains, narrow roads, and sub-zero temperatures. In late November, these forces found themselves surrounded by tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers. What followed was one of the most heroic and harrowing battles of the war. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir lasted over 2 weeks. United States Marines of the 1st Marine Division, along with Army soldiers and South Korean units, fought in near constant combat against overwhelming odds. The Chinese used the terrain to their advantage, launching attacks from higher ground and cutting off supply lines. But despite the encirclement and brutal conditions, the United Nations forces did not collapse. Instead, they organized a fighting withdrawal, moving south toward the port city of Hungnam, while fending off continuous assaults. Artillery, air support, and tight unit discipline allowed the Marines to hold their positions and protect their wounded. Frozen ground made it difficult to dig trenches, and vehicles often stalled in the cold. Still, the troops pushed forward. By mid-December, the surviving forces had reached Hungnam. There, a massive evacuation operation began. Over 200 ships assembled to extract over 100,000 soldiers, along with an estimated 90,000 civilians who fled with them. This evacuation, often compared to Dunkirk, was one of the largest amphibious withdrawals in modern military history. It was carried out under pressure and in harsh conditions, yet it succeeded. The Chinese offensive had turned the war on its head. In just a few weeks, United Nations forces went from advancing toward a final victory to scrambling for survival. The North Korean capital of Pyongyang, which had been taken in October, was abandoned. Cities and towns in the north fell back under communist control. By the end of December, United Nations forces had retreated below the 38th parallel. In early January of 1951, Chinese and North Korean troops recaptured Seoul. It was the 4th time the capital had changed hands during the war. This dramatic reversal led to growing concern in Washington and other Allied capitals. The war, once viewed as a limited conflict, was now threatening to expand. Some U.S. military leaders, including General MacArthur, began calling for broader measures, including airstrikes on Chinese territory and the possible use of nuclear weapons. These proposals alarmed President Truman and America's allies, who feared that escalating the war could bring the Soviet Union directly into the conflict. In response to the worsening situation, President Truman relieved MacArthur of his command in April of 1951. The decision was controversial. MacArthur was popular in the United States, seen by many as a hero. But Truman believed that the general had overstepped his authority and risked widening the war beyond Korea. Leadership of United Nations forces passed to General Matthew Ridgway, a decorated and respected officer who had served as deputy to General Walker, who had died in a vehicle accident during the retreat. General Ridgway faced the difficult task of stabilizing the front and rebuilding morale. He quickly reorganized United Nations forces, strengthened defensive positions, and launched limited counterattacks to halt the communist advance. By early spring, the tide began to shift once again. Ridgway's strategy emphasized mobility, supply discipline, and close cooperation between infantry and air power. In a series of well-coordinated operations, United Nations forces retook lost ground and pushed the front line back to the 38th parallel. Seoul was recaptured for the second time in March of 1951. The Chinese intervention had dramatically changed the course of the war, but it had not broken the United Nations coalition. After months of chaos and retreat, the front began to stabilize. By the summer of 1951, the war had reached a new phase, not of rapid movement, but of grinding stalemate. The two sides would now face each other along a shifting, but mostly static line near the 38th parallel. Trenches were dug, outposts were fortified, and the war settled into a pattern that would persist for the next 2 years. The cost of the Chinese intervention was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers died on both sides. Civilians suffered immensely, displaced from their homes, caught in crossfire, or exposed to winter without shelter or aid. Cities changed hands repeatedly, leaving behind only ruins. The dream of a quick victory had vanished. The war had become something different, longer, bloodier, and far more uncertain. Chapter 7. Stalemate and Attrition. The war slows down. By the middle of 1951, the Korean War had shifted dramatically from a conflict of sweeping advances to one of static lines, brutal attrition, and cautious calculation. After a year of stunning reversals, from North Korea's initial invasion to the United Nations landing at Inchon, and then the powerful Chinese intervention, both sides now faced each other near the 38th parallel once again. This was where it had all begun, and now it had become the center of a prolonged, grinding stalemate. The front lines stretched roughly across the peninsula, following ridges, rivers, and valleys from the Yellow Sea in the west to the Sea of Japan in the east. It was not a perfectly straight line. It bent and curved with the geography, cutting through rural farmland, forested hills, and small villages. Both sides began to fortify their positions. Trenches were dug deep into the earth, lined with sandbags and reinforced with timber. Bunkers were constructed to house troops, ammunition, and medical supplies. Observation posts were built on high ground to monitor enemy movement. Barbed wire, minefields, and booby traps turned once open landscapes into kill zones. What emerged was a kind of modern trench warfare, not unlike what had been seen during the First World War. Days were marked by artillery fire, patrols, and occasional attempts to seize outposts. Nights brought raids, ambushes, and infiltration missions. Movement was slow, and gains were often measured in yards rather than miles. The fighting was fierce. In the hills near the central front, battles raged over places that would become infamous. Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, Pork Chop Hill. These locations, often little more than rocky elevations or tree-covered knolls, were seen as strategically important for observation or artillery placement. Taking one of these hills could cost hundreds or even thousands of lives, and holding it often cost more. At Heartbreak Ridge in September and October of 1951, American and French troops battled entrenched North Korean and Chinese forces for over a month. The terrain was rugged, the weather unpredictable, and the enemy well dug in. Mortars and artillery filled the air. Machine gun nests turned open slopes into killing fields. Even when United Nations troops succeeded in capturing the ridge, they found themselves counterattacked again and again. The objective of such battles was often less about gaining ground and more about wearing down the opponent. Both sides hoped to bleed the other into submission. It became a war of endurance. At the same time, political leaders began to seek a negotiated end to the conflict. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, supported the Chinese and North Korean war effort, but it did not want to escalate the conflict into a direct confrontation with the United States. China too had suffered heavy casualties and economic strain. In the West, public support for the war was beginning to waver. The rapid victories of 1950 had been replaced by a long, costly stalemate. The enthusiasm that once supported continued fighting was eroding. In July of 1951, peace talks began in the town of Kaesong, near the front lines. The negotiations were complex from the beginning. Disagreements arose over everything from the location of talks to the shape of the negotiating table. Trust between the parties was nearly non-existent. Eventually, the talks moved to the village of Panmunjom, which would become the site of the most prolonged and detailed negotiations of the war. One of the most contentious issues was the question of prisoners of war. By this point in the conflict, both sides had captured tens of thousands of enemy soldiers. The United Nations wanted to allow prisoners to choose whether to return to their home country. Many Chinese and North Korean prisoners expressed a desire not to be repatriated, fearing punishment or execution if they returned. The communist side, however, insisted that all prisoners be returned regardless of personal wishes. This issue would stall the peace talks for over a year. Meanwhile, the war continued. For soldiers on the front lines, life was dominated by monotony, fear, and hardship. The weather was a constant enemy. Summers were hot, humid, and filled with insects. Winters were cold, bitter, and dangerous. Frostbite, disease, and exposure were daily concerns. Rations were basic. Sleep was interrupted by bombardments. Letters from home were rare and treasured. Patrols were among the most dangerous duties. Small units would venture into enemy territory under cover of darkness to gather intelligence, sabotage positions, or capture prisoners. These missions were often deadly. If ambushed, surrounded, or injured, soldiers could not expect quick rescue. Snipers targeted exposed positions. Artillery barrages came without warning, and always there was the threat of a sudden attack or counterattack on a key hill or outpost. Despite the hardships, soldiers on both sides adapted to the conditions. Bonds of friendship and loyalty grew strong in the trenches. Humor, games, and shared routines helped pass the time. Many soldiers kept journals, sketched or carved tokens to remember their service. Back home, the Korean War became known as the Forgotten War. Unlike the Second World War, it lacked dramatic declarations, clear victories, or decisive endings. It was not celebrated in the same way. Yet for those who fought, the sacrifices were real and the cost high. Between 1951 and 1953, the casualty count rose steadily. By the end of the war, over 36,000 American troops had been killed, with more than 100,000 wounded. South Korea suffered over 1 million military and civilian casualties. Chinese and North Korean losses were estimated in the hundreds of thousands as well. The longer the war dragged on, the clearer it became that neither side could achieve total victory. By early 1953, peace negotiations resumed with greater urgency. A new administration had taken office in the United States. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, elected in November of 1952, had pledged to bring the war to a close. Behind the scenes, quiet signals were also coming from Moscow and Beijing. With Stalin's death in March of 1953, the Soviet position softened. The Chinese leadership, burdened by economic hardship and ongoing military losses, was also more willing to end the war. The stage was set for a final resolution, but before that, the war would continue to claim lives. Hill battles, artillery duels, and sniper engagements carried on. In the final weeks, fighting intensified as both sides sought to secure territory before a ceasefire. The Korean War, by now, was no longer about winning or losing. It had become about endurance, negotiation, and the painful process of finding an end to something that had spiraled far beyond its original scope. Chapter 8. The Armistice. Ceasefire without peace. By the summer of 1953, after 3 long years of war, negotiations at Panmunjom had begun to show signs of progress. For over 2 years, the talks had dragged on with little movement, bogged down by disagreements over prisoners of war, the location of a new boundary, and the logistics of enforcing a future truce. But now, with Stalin gone from the Soviet leadership, with the new US president in office, and with both sides worn down by years of conflict, the end was finally in sight. It had been a war of movement, then a war of reversals, and then a war of attrition. Now, it would become a war with no clear winner. The central sticking point in negotiations had long been the fate of prisoners of war. The United Nations, and particularly the United States, insisted that prisoners should not be forced to return to their countries against their will. Thousands of Chinese and North Korean soldiers held in camps expressed a desire not to go back. Many feared punishment or execution if they were returned to their governments. The communist side, however, insisted on total repatriation. All prisoners returned, regardless of their personal wishes. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Prisoners who refused repatriation would be turned over to a neutral commission where they would be interviewed and allowed to decide their fate over time. This agreement broke the stalemate. Meanwhile, Both sides worked on establishing what the final military boundary would look like. Though the 38th parallel had once divided the two Koreas, years of fighting had shifted the line in many places. The new boundary would follow the front lines as they stood in July of 1953, creating a buffer zone known as the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. This new zone would be approximately 2.5 miles wide, stretching across the entire peninsula. It would be heavily fortified and monitored, but no military forces would be allowed inside. The DMZ would not be a place of peace exactly, but a zone of silence, an uneasy strip of land between two armed nations. On July 27th, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed at Panmunjom. The signatories included General William Harrison Jr., representing the United Nations Command, and General Nam Il, representing the Korean People's Army and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. Notably, no South Korean official signed the document. President Syngman Rhee of South Korea opposed the armistice, believing that it would leave the peninsula permanently divided. He had hoped the war would continue until complete unification under his government could be achieved. Nonetheless, the ceasefire went into effect. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the guns began to fall silent. On both sides of the front, soldiers stopped firing. Artillery crews stood down, machine guns were lowered, and, for the first time in over 3 years, the sounds of war were replaced by an unfamiliar quiet. There was no celebration. The war had not ended in victory. There were no parades or cheering crowds. For the soldiers in the trenches, there was relief and uncertainty. Most had lost comrades. Many were wounded, physically or psychologically. All were exhausted. The numbers told a staggering story. By the time the armistice was signed, approximately 36,000 American soldiers had been killed in action. Over 90,000 were wounded. South Korean military deaths numbered over 240,000, with civilian casualties reaching into the millions. China's military is estimated to have lost between 180,000 and 400,000 soldiers. North Korea's losses were similarly high, with hundreds of thousands dead and vast portions of the country in ruins. Entire cities had been flattened by bombing. Farmland had been burned. Bridges, roads, and factories had been destroyed. Families were separated, villages divided, and communities forever altered. Over 21,000 Chinese and North Korean prisoners chose not to return home. They were eventually resettled in countries like Taiwan and India. In the months after the armistice, wounded soldiers were exchanged in an operation called Little Switch. Later, in Big Switch, the full exchange of remaining prisoners took place. The armistice established the rules for a long-term ceasefire, but it was never intended to be a formal peace treaty. As a result, North and South Korea technically remained, and still remain, in a state of war. No peace treaty has ever been signed. In the years that followed, the Korean Peninsula would remain divided along the DMZ. Both Koreas would rebuild, but in dramatically different ways. In the north, Kim Il-sung would solidify his control, establishing a dynasty that would persist for generations. In the south, under Syngman Rhee and later democratic governments, South Korea would eventually transform into one of the most advanced economies in the world. The Korean War, often called the Forgotten War, was anything but forgettable to those who lived through it. For the soldiers who fought, the memories of the hills, the rivers, the mud, and the snow would remain. For the families who lost loved ones, the war marked a permanent absence. For Koreans, both in the North and the South, the war was not just a geopolitical conflict. It was personal. It reshaped the entire peninsula, splitting a culture and a people in two. Decades later, the DMZ would become one of the most heavily guarded borders on Earth. Watchtowers, electric fences, landmines, and soldiers stand on both sides, monitoring each other in tense silence. Yet within the DMZ, where humans rarely tread, wildlife has returned. Deer, cranes, and even leopards have been seen in this accidental sanctuary of peace amid preparation for war. The Korean War ended not with a bang, but with a signature, and yet its legacy continues. The armistice stopped the fighting, but it did not resolve the conflict. It drew a line across the land and across history that has yet to be fully erased. Chapter 9: Aftermath. Rebuilding a divided peninsula. The Korean War left behind a landscape shaped by fire, loss, and division. Though the armistice signed in July of 1953 brought an end to the fighting, it did not bring peace. The peninsula remained split in two, north and south, separated by a strip of land called the Demilitarized Zone. The war had destroyed cities, dislocated millions, and carved a wound that would take generations to begin to heal. The immediate aftermath was defined by devastation. In the south, entire communities had been flattened. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, had changed hands multiple times during the war and was left heavily damaged. Roads and bridges lay in ruins. Farmland had been scorched or flooded. Millions of civilians had been killed, injured, or displaced. Families had been separated by the advancing and retreating front lines, often never to reunite. Thousands of children had been orphaned. The South Korean government, led by President Syngman Rhee, faced the enormous task of rebuilding a shattered society. Basic infrastructure had to be restored. Housing had to be rebuilt. Food and medicine were desperately needed. The economy, already fragile before the war, was now in complete disarray. International aid played a crucial role. The United States, which had committed significant resources to defending the South, now invested heavily in its reconstruction. Billions of dollars in economic and military assistance flowed into the country. Schools were reopened, hospitals were rebuilt, factories slowly returned to operation. But the road to recovery would not be easy. South Korea in the 1950s and early 1960s remained politically unstable and economically underdeveloped. President Rhee ruled with increasing authoritarianism, suppressing dissent and using the threat of communism to justify harsh crackdowns. Corruption was widespread, and poverty remained the reality for most citizens. Still, the seeds of transformation were being planted. Over time, South Korea would evolve into a thriving democracy and one of the world's leading economies. But in the years just after the war, it was still a nation deeply wounded. In the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, under Kim Il-sung, began its own process of rebuilding, albeit under a very different model. North Korea received significant support from China and the Soviet Union. With their help, the regime rebuilt key industries, restored transportation networks, and re-established government control. But it also used the aftermath of war to tighten its grip on power. The state purged suspected dissenters, elevated Kim Il-sung to a near-deity status, and established one of the most repressive regimes in modern history. The ideology of juche, or self-reliance, became the core of North Korea's identity. While presented as a philosophy of independence and strength, it masked a system built on surveillance, fear, and absolute loyalty to the ruling family. In the years following the war, the government solidified control over the population through propaganda, isolation, and widespread repression. The country was rebuilt, but at a cost. Labor camps, show trials, and purges became common. Dissent was crushed. The government controlled nearly every aspect of daily life, from education to employment to personal relationships. Unlike the South, which would open itself to the world, North Korea increasingly turned inward. It rejected Western influence, distanced itself even from its communist allies, and began developing a unique brand of dictatorship that would endure for decades. For both Koreas, the armistice did not end the conflict. It simply froze it. The demilitarized zone, stretching across the entire width of the peninsula, became the most heavily fortified border in the world. Guard towers, landmines, concrete bunkers, and razor wire defined the boundary. Soldiers from both sides stood watch day and night, often just a few hundred feet apart. Occasionally, the silence of the DMZ was broken. Small clashes erupted from time to time. Propaganda broadcasts blared across the divide. Leaflets were dropped from balloons. Spies were caught. Defectors made daring escapes across mountains, rivers, and minefields. But despite the tension, large-scale fighting did not resume. The human cost of division was immense. Families that had lived together for generations were now separated by a border they could not cross. Letters could not be sent. Phone calls could not be made. In some cases, people did not even know if their relatives had survived. Reunions, when they were allowed many years later, were brief and emotional, a glimpse of what had been lost. Around the world, the Korean War faded from public consciousness. It was overshadowed by the Second World War that had come before, and the Vietnam War that followed. It was often called the Forgotten War in the West, despite its enormous toll. But in Korea, it was never forgotten. For South Koreans, the war remained a national trauma, a reminder of vulnerability, sacrifice, and resilience. For North Koreans, it was used as a justification for continued militarization and state control. Each side developed its own narrative, its own version of history, shaped by ideology and experience. And while the guns had fallen silent, the war lived on in memory, policy, and posture. Over the following decades, South Korea would transform. Economic reforms, investment in education, and a growing manufacturing sector led to what became known as the Miracle on the Han River. By the 1980s, South Korea was emerging as a global economic power. Democracy came gradually through protests, negotiations, and constitutional reform. Today, South Korea is known for its vibrant culture, strong institutions, and global influence. North Korea, by contrast, grew more isolated. Kim Il-sung was succeeded by his son, Kim Jong-il, who was later succeeded by his son, Kim Jong-un. The regime maintained tight control, developed nuclear weapons, and continued to present the United States and South Korea as existential threats. The economy stagnated. Famine, isolation, and fear became part of daily life for many citizens. Still, the division endured. And every year on July 27th, both Koreas and the world mark the day the war paused but did not end. In the South, it is remembered with solemnity. In the North, it is celebrated as Victory Day, though no official victory was ever declared. The legacy of the Korean War is one of paradox. It is a war that ended without a peace treaty, a war that split one people into two nations, a war that devastated both sides, yet defined their futures. Chapter 10. Legacy. The war that never ended. The Korean War officially came to a halt on July 27th, 1953. But in a very real sense, it never truly ended. No peace treaty was ever signed. No formal conclusion was ever reached. What emerged instead was a tense, fragile armistice, a pause in hostilities that has lasted decades, but never erased the line drawn through the heart of the Korean Peninsula. The legacy of the Korean War is vast and complicated. It shaped the political, social, and cultural fabric of both North and South Korea. It redefined the role of the United States in East Asia, and it became a symbolic battleground in the broader Cold War, a place where two opposing ideologies collided, not only in battle, but in the very lives of the people on either side of the 38th parallel. For South Korea, the war was a tragedy, but also a turning point. In the early years after the armistice, South Korea was a poor, war-torn nation struggling to recover. Infrastructure had been shattered. Millions had been displaced. But over the following decades, South Korea underwent one of the most remarkable transformations of the modern era. Through investment in education, support from international allies, and a deep cultural emphasis on resilience, the country rebuilt itself. By the late 20th century, South Korea had become a global economic force. The miracle on the Han River, as it came to be known, saw the nation rise from post-war poverty to become one of the world's most technologically advanced societies. Its cities flourished, its democracy took root, and its people redefined what was possible in the wake of devastation. Yet, the memory of the war remains vivid. It lives in the stories passed down through generations, in the scars of veterans, and in the reunions of families long separated by a border that cannot be crossed. South Korea's military remains one of the most prepared in the world, not because it seeks conflict, but because the threat has never entirely disappeared. In the North, the legacy took a very different shape. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea emerged from the war hardened and isolated. Its leadership, under Kim Il-sung and his successors, built a regime that claimed victory in the war and used it as the foundation of its national myth. The narrative promoted to the population framed the conflict as a heroic struggle against imperialist aggression, cementing the rule of the Kim dynasty as defenders of Korean sovereignty. In reality, the North Korean regime became one of the most authoritarian and secretive governments in the world. Its economy, heavily reliant on state control and military spending, struggled. Famines in the 1990s devastated the population. Political dissent was crushed. The war's end had not brought peace. It had brought permanent militarization. Perhaps the most visible legacy of the Korean War is the demilitarized zone. Stretching over 150 miles from coast to coast, the DMZ is one of the most heavily fortified borders on the planet. Watchtowers, minefields, and bunkers line the narrow strip of land. Soldiers from both sides stand guard day and night, watching each other across a no-man's land that symbolizes both ceasefire and unresolved conflict. Paradoxically, this zone of intense military readiness has also become an accidental sanctuary. Because it has been virtually untouched by humans for decades, wildlife has flourished. Rare species of birds, mammals, and plants live within its boundaries. The DMZ has become a place where nature, not war, has quietly reclaimed the land. Despite the tension, there have been moments of hope. In the years since the war, various efforts have been made to bring the two Koreas closer. Families separated by the conflict have occasionally been allowed to meet in brief, emotional reunions. Diplomats from North and South have held talks, sometimes leading to reductions in hostility, sometimes ending in renewed mistrust. In recent years, summits between leaders of North Korea, South Korea, and the United States have captured global attention. These meetings, filled with symbolism and cautious optimism, have not yet produced lasting agreements. But they show that even 70 years after the war began, the desire for peace remains alive. The war's legacy also extends beyond the peninsula. The Korean War helped shape the modern world order. It marked the first time the United Nations authorized military force to repel aggression. It set the stage for American military alliances in Asia, including treaties with Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines. It deepened the Cold War divide between East and West, and it established the United States as a permanent presence in Korea, a role that continues to this day with thousands of American troops stationed in the South. For veterans of the war, the legacy is deeply personal. The men and women who served came from many countries: the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Turkey, Australia, and others, all under the banner of the United Nations. They fought in freezing mountains, across river valleys, through monsoons, and in rice paddies. Many were young, far from home, and unsure of the politics that had brought them there. Some never came home. Others returned with physical and emotional wounds. Many felt forgotten, overshadowed by the Second World War before them and the Vietnam War after. And yet, their service helped preserve a nation's sovereignty and gave rise to one of the world's most remarkable recoveries. In schools and textbooks, the Korean War is often given only a few pages, a brief chapter between greater wars. But to those who lived through it, and to the people of Korea, it was, and is, so much more. It was a moment when a country was divided, a time when great powers clashed, a war that stopped but never truly concluded. The Korean War lives on in every soldier's medal, every separated family photo, and every quiet morning in the shadow of the DMZ. It is the war that never ended, but also the war that reminds us that peace, though fragile, is worth striving for.